Science for Seminary programs at Howard University School of Divinity and the School of Theology and Religious Studies of Catholic University of America. Moderating the session will be Trulear, Associate Professor of Applied Theology at the School of Divinity. Panelists include John Ahn, Assistant Professor of Hebrew Bible at the School of Divinity, Daryl Domning, Professor of Anatomy at the School of Medicine at Howard University, and James Stark, who's a PhD candidate in Liturgical Studies and Sacramental Theology at Catholic University of America, who's been very, very involved in course revisions at Catholic University and engaged also in his own work as well at the intersection of theology and science. So Dr. Trulear is going to begin the session with his own statement, and then from there he'll direct our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Ware. I feel like saying, give me honor to God. Our Baptist ministers usually start there.
Is that inappropriate for science?
Giving honor to the cosmos. First of all, I want to thank AAAS for the work and the leadership in this area. Appreciate it very much. It's been very helpful to me as one of the professors invited by Dr. Ware to do the type of curricular work that's been discussed in the opening session as a sociologist of religion. Dr. Davis, I was already confused enough disciplinarily teaching with theologians, and now I am thoroughly confused. So keep me in prayer. I want to welcome everyone to our opening panel. The subject is social justice, science, and religion. This session frames our discussion by acknowledging Howard University School of Divinity's historic role in the struggle for justice for people of the African diaspora and its intersection between that history and contemporary issues. Martin Luther King, who was taught and mentored by a Mount Rushmore of HU giants such as Benjamin Mays, Howard Thurman, and Mordecai Johnson, was fond of quoting these words from James Russell Lowell. New occasions teach new duties. Time makes ancient good uncouth. They must upward and must onward who would keep abreast of truth. This is an upward and onward moment. But like King and his mentors, it is grounded in the historic commitment to social justice. In the Howard University School of Divinity iteration of Science for Seminaries, we've attempted to represent that reality. It is represented in our use of George Washington Carver's faith-filled commitment to remain at a historically black college, Tuskegee Institute, in order to use science to provide justice and equity for poor black farmers, as opposed to taking a lead scientist post with Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company. It finds exploration in our initiative in looking at competing definitions of mental health and disability with respect for religion and science, and the implications of such for mass incarceration. Cosmology and anthropology engage in a conversation that envisions justice for black bodies. Our panelists for this discussion represent similar commitment. Their study of crime, ecology, and evolution converse with migration, liturgics, and theodicy this morning. Their common roots in the quest for a just vision of theological anthropology and community will bring flower to our discussion. Allow me to be more specific in introducing our panelists this morning. Professor John Ahn is Assistant Professor of Hebrew Bible at Howard University School of Divinity. a recognized scholar in the study of exilic forced migration period, 6th century before the Christian era. He is the founder and served as the chair of the Exile Forced Migrations Group, Society of Biblical Literature annual meetings from 2008 through 2012. His monographs, authored and edited, include The Prophets Speak of Forced Migration, By the Irrigation Canals of Babylon, and Exile as Forced Migrations. His current work in progress is The Last of Kings on Forced Migrations. In his Hebrew Bible course, he uses paleoclimatology, the study of past climates, in order to interpret exile and migration. Professor Daryl Domning is professor of anatomy at Howard University School of Medicine. He is the convener of the Religion and Science Group of the Washington Theological Consortium, science advisor to the School of Divinity Science for Seminaries project. He is the author, along with Monica K. Helbig, of Original Selfishness, Original Sin and Evil in the Light of Evolution. In his work, he shows how evolution, if viewed from the proper angle, solves the problems of evil and theodicy. He points to the emergence of not only evil, but also cooperation, love, altruism, and community, fictive kin, in evolution. James Stark is a PhD candidate in liturgical studies and sacramental theology at the Catholic University of America in Washington. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Physics from Parks College of Engineering, Aviation, and Technology at St. Louis University, the Master of Arts degree in Liturgical Studies and Sacramental Theology from Catholic University. He has worked closely with Dr. Stefanos Alexopoulos on revisions of the Foundation of the Liturgy and Sacramental Theology course, incorporating neuroscience into this course and other courses on ritual courses. He has also worked closely with Monsignor Kevin W. Irwin in his work on sacramentality and ecology, especially his upcoming commentary on Pope Francis' encyclical letter, Laudato Si, forthcoming from the Paul's Press. We're going to ask that we begin in that order, Dr. Ahn and Dr. Domning, and then Mr. Stark, and ask them each to present 10 to 15 minutes on their understanding of the topic of religion and science in seminaries with respect to how your work reflects the commitment to social justice that is part and parcel of Howard University's history, but also a general commitment to people of color and of the African diaspora.
I just have a quick question before I begin. Would you all prefer a short PowerPoint presentation, or just listening is okay?
If you haven't used it.
My background a little bit. I'm a second-generation Korean American. I grew up in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, so that makes sense of how I winded up in Hebrew Bible studies. I went to more bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs than anyone that I know of. But my father's also a Presbyterian minister, and so church was part of our upbringing and our ritual as well, too. I went to seminary, I went to graduate school, and by accident, I met this brilliant archaeologist by the name of Harvey Weiss back in late 1990s or so. And Harvey Weiss was in the Near Eastern Languages and Civilization Department at Yale, and he was doing something extraordinary at the time. And he was using paleoclimatology with archaeology. And as an archaeologist, he got on the cover of Nature, which is just, one of those things that is just, and he was just excited. And so I sat in one of his classes and then took another class, and then I winded up TAing for him, and just naturally got into something called paleoclimatology. It was so radical in the field back in the late 90s, early 2000. I asked one of our so-called gurus, or what we would say, those who hold, the gates, the field at large, and I asked one of my mentors and dear colleagues at the time, do you think the field is ready for paleoclimatology? And he said, absolutely not. And I asked him why, and he said simply, you cannot mix the sciences with ancient sources. But here we are in the 21st century here, and we've come full circle. And I'm excited to be here. And what I wanted to share with you this morning is just a brief understanding of what, a brief understanding of what paleoclimatology is. And then from that point, I want to introduce to you two problems that we have in Hebrew Bible studies, and how paleoclimatology can offer a solution, a suggestion, or possibility to the problems that we have in the study of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. For some of you who may be familiar with what paleoclimatology is, it is the study of ancient records of what ancient climates were like. We normally divide historical records based upon written records, and based upon our written records, we have something called direct measure versus proxy records. But the earliest events of El Nino, as some of you are all familiar with, we can record them as late as or early as 1500s. Of course, these impacted harvests, it impacted migration, and so-called hurricanes and landfalls. We can see the artworks that are captured in the time historical period based upon the so-called the records of the historical sort of climate. And when we say that there are these historical records, we're talking about instrumental sort of data that folks have in the past have recorded about what the weather was like. Weather is short-term, climate is long-term. And so based upon these years of instrumental records, historical data, such as tree rings, and then we get to what paleoclimatologists get excited about: ice core sediments, lake sediments, coral reef and ocean sediments, and continental and coastal sediments. Just to give you a quick technical sort of data analysis, some of you are familiar with carbon-14 dating and the half-lives. And so what scientists are actually measuring is the C14, the carbon dating of certain sort of areas that get remained in fossils or in ancient spleothemes or even stalactites and stalagmites. We also see this in what we will call quantitative information that we see in the isotopes at large. There are variances between oxygen-16, oxygen-17, and O18. Certain levels of isotopes, O16, is lighter than O18. And so the heavier they are, they likely become to fall as rain, and O16 tends to sort of evaporate more quickly. Now, some of this technical information may sort of, for theologians, be in over our head. And so I'm just going to keep it very simple, but to explain to you what the important aspects of this is, I want to take you to what we will call lake sediments, and especially what we will call ice core sediments. If I have I'll start with this. So in the world right now, there's this project called GISP-2, Greenland Ice Sheet Project. It is one of the most fascinating subject matters in the world, because what they have done is they go to the center of Iceland and they drill a deep, deep hole into the center. And they take out these ice core sediments, take it out, and they would slice it like prosciutto. And if you know how thin those prosciutto hams are. And they begin to examine how much acidification or rain that there is, globally speaking. And that gives us a proxy data, gives us information to be able to measure how much rainfall that there was, globally speaking. And so it's at the top of the globe at large, and so it becomes one set of data. However, that's not enough. To study the ancient Near East, they would do something very parallel and try to create a triangulation. There's a lake called Lake Van near Turkey, or in Turkey at large. And what they've done with is an exact same sort of parallel sort of context, where they would take they would drill, go way to the bottom of the ocean, and they would drill the exact same sort of, and they would take out core sediments and see how much rainfall, and they're able to analyze how much rainfall that was in the so-called Turkey area. They do one last sort of triangulation by going to a cave called Cave Surik in Israel. So now there's a triangulation between Greenland and Turkey and Israel, and we can get a proxy, and we would study these sets of data to see how much rainfall that there was globally and regionally impacting Israel as well too. And so we can get hardcore data to show specific information of how much rainfall that there was, how little rainfall that there was, and in addition to that, we're also able to provide information based upon this scientific data, fascinating sort of outcomes, only that scientists would have understood or talk about in their own sort of setting. Okay, shifting gears now on the Hebrew Bible side. Some of you know that there's a period in the Bible called David and Goliath. You familiar with Goliath? Right? Mm-hmm. Now, some of you may have learned that the period of David and Goliath is a mythopoetic construct, but there were a group of people called the Philistines. The Philistines were a real group of people. They all lived in an area called ancient Anatolia, what we will call modern-day Turkey. They dominated the iron sort of works, and they had absolute control of iron ore and had iron technology. There was a problem in the 14th century, moving to the 13th century. All of a sudden, these people migrated. They decided to move from where they were living, and they got on boats, and they winded up on the sort of what we will call the western shore of the Levant, or what we say Israel. And they set up cities, Philistine cities, like Ashkelon, Gaza, and several other cities. For the longest time, brilliant scholars like George Mendenhall said, oh, the reason why the Philistines moved is because of ancient warfare. There was a strong group of folks who came and sort of attacked these sort of Philistines, and they were forced to leave their homelands, and they took their goods and they found an area that was suitable for their so-called new habitation. Fast forward. What scientists have discovered during this time period was that there was long period of drought. There was no rain. There is no civilization that can survive without natural resources such as water. So if there was a 60-year dry spell, no matter how advanced your society is, you can't survive. And so the new theory is the possibility of these Philistines migrating due to acidification, dry spell, and we have the data to back this up. Let's fast forward one more time period into the 6th century BC. This is a time when there's global sort of energy. In the Far East, in India, you have translations and works of Hindu classics. In China, you have this global understanding of Confucius and Lao Tzu taking place. In Greece, you have this entire sort of new ideologies and fascinating new sort of philosophies coming about. And at the time, the global empire in the Middle East, or what we call the ancient Near East, is the Neo-Babylonians. The Neo-Babylonians, who sort of reign only for about a period of 60 years or so, are at the hegemony, at the top of the empire, as we would say. What they were brilliant at doing was they took groups of people from their conquered homelands and they resettled and displaced them to what we will call, let's see if I have some pictures for that, what they will call their new homes and new settlements. One of the key features of what the Neo-Babylonians did was they displaced and resettled hundreds and hundreds of people. Not thousands, but hundreds and hundreds of people from what we will say, what we will call Jerusalem, all the way to Babylon. One of the fascinating things about the study of the Neo-Babylonians is whoever controlled the water system controlled the political system. In other words, we have the two major rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. Euphrates is closer to the European side, whereas the Tigris, and they created irrigation canals. Till now, we all simply sort of said, oh, it's just part of nature that they created irrigation canals. If you look, even in Washington, D.C., we have the Potomac River right here, and then there's a canal. You've seen that as well, too. It was probably used for irrigation purposes. Ancient irrigations had a primary canal, then they have a secondary canal, and a tertiary canal. It's still like that even in the 21st century. What the ancient Neo-Babylonians received and inherited from their predecessors, the Assyrians, and from the Sumerians, is this irrigation canal system. But we can tell from satellite data that they irrigated more than in any previous generations of civilization. In other words, we have more records of irrigation canals than ever before. And these are some of the major irrigation canals. And so when you even hear songs like "By the Waters of Babylon," there we live and there we wept, it's probably more accurate to say by the irrigation canals of Babylon. All right, so the big question has always been, what does these irrigation canals to do with migration? We can tell from 6th century BC climatologic records that there was aridification going on. There was a big, big dry spell at this time. And so in order to produce the cereal, they had to irrigate these canals, over-irrigate them. But when you over-irrigate, there's a common problem that develops, salinization of the water. That salinization is production of salt in the water. There's only one way to remove salt, physically and manually. And so the Judeans were displaced and resettled in the 6th century to remove this. So the first group were taken in 597. A second wave displaced and resettled again in 587, and a third wave in 582 BCE in 3 separate migrations. So the Judeans were forced to work on these irrigation canals. Now the large issue, the ramifications we're talking about, is the movement of these people resulted because of paleoclimatology. Of course, there's socioeconomic factors involved, there are political factors involved, but one of the newest things in which paleoclimatology can offer to biblical studies is a new way of looking at ancient texts. It also provides a way to solve past problems, classic problems that have created an impasse in our field. And what paleoclimatology offers is new avenues, exciting sort of fresh breath of air to re-examine classic old theological issues and offering a bridge between the sciences and Hebrew Bible. Thank you very much. Should I just close off this?
Okay, well, I'm Daryl Domning. As you heard, I'm a paleontologist. I'm also a Roman Catholic from that faith tradition. And my role here is to work with the School of Divinity, particularly on topics relating to evolution, not paleontology in itself, but the implications of evolutionary science for theology. And I got interested early on, I guess back in graduate school days, in the evolution creationism controversy, which is all about why some religious believers see evolutionary science as a threat and why it isn't the threat that they think it is. And in fact, mainstream Christianity, for example, can coexist quite comfortably with Darwin's theory of evolution, in my opinion. I'll say a little more about that. But then, over the years, my interests in science and religion turned onto a rather different track. When I became aware of studies of animal behavior, especially ape behavior, that were being done some decades ago by folks like Jane Goodall, Franz de Waal, and a whole raft of other folks in the ethology part of anthropology and animal biology. For the first time in human history, these folks were going out in the wild and carefully watching what these animals did in the wild and among themselves. We didn't have that kind of information before. And what struck me reading about their work was how similar these animals' behavior is to our own. It's scary how similar a lot of it is. And they can show kindness to one another. They cooperate. They make up after quarrels. Do other nice things like that. But what was a lot more interesting, certainly to me, was the bad stuff that they do. Bad in our viewpoint. Things like deceit, theft, violence, murder, infanticide, cannibalism, lethal warfare. All things that we condemn when humans do them. And having been trained in comparative biology, you could call it, looking not just at the morphology, the anatomical differences between animals in general, and trying to use those data to figure out how animals are related, something we paleontologists spend a lot of time doing. But using these resemblances among animals to decipher, to infer the genealogical connections among them. So I suddenly realized that the most parsimonious reason that human misbehaviors are so like those of, or the behaviors of other animals that we would call misbehaviors when we did similar things, why these misbehaviors are so alike between us and other animals is that they must have been inherited. These behavior patterns must have been inherited from a common ancestor. And this is a typical kind of inference that we make in what's called phylogenetic analysis or cladistic analysis. They inherited these behavior patterns from a common ancestor that also must have behaved that way. And the thing that all these bad acts have in common is that they all tend to promote self-preservation, self-reproduction. We can call them, in shorthand, selfish in the broad sense, self-centered acts. And these acts are necessarily enforced by natural selection. Darwinian theory, anything that promotes your survival and reproduction, any trait, any behavior pattern, any anatomical structure that promotes your survival and reproduction will tend to be preserved in the course of evolution. This is the core idea of Darwinian theory. These traits, these behavior patterns, whether we call them good or bad, are adaptive. And therefore, they must have been inseparable from life itself, from the very earliest one-celled organisms. Anything that reproduces itself, and that we therefore call life, must have been subject to selection for adaptive traits. Well, having been raised Catholic, I couldn't miss seeing the relevance of all this to sin, and especially original sin, which I hadn't thought about since my grade school catechism, I don't think, but it suddenly dawned on me that this body of information that the ethologists were coming up with was directly relevant to the ancient questions of original sin in Christian theology, and the larger philosophical question or problem of evil. Creationists argue that if evolution does away with a literal Adam and Eve, then there's no way to explain evil and sin that lets God off the hook for creating them. This is a basic idea of theodicy. How do you justify the ways of God? How does an all-powerful and all-good creator tolerate, let alone be responsible for creating the bad stuff in the world? Ancient problem. But I saw that the creationists have it exactly wrong. It's, there is in the evolutionary data a straightforward solution to this problem. Dr. Trulear raised the issue of social justice. Well, I would say that if you're going to do something to promote justice, it helps if you understand injustice and where it comes from and where bad behavior comes from. And so I'll try to give you an idea of my thinking along these lines, because you need to understand your enemy, know your enemy, if you're going to fight the forces of injustice, whatever they may be. So taking the problem of evil in the broadest sense, we distinguish physical evil and moral evil. So, physical evil including suffering, animal suffering, human suffering, these sorts of things. And then moral evil, which is what we call sin, attribute that only to humans, to intelligent, moral actors. Well, going back to the beginning, physics tells us that all matter is made up of parts. Molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, quarks, strings, as far down as you want to take it. Matter consists of parts that are constantly in motion. And we know that anything made of parts can come apart and has an inconvenient way of doing so exactly when we don't want it to. And this is, when you think about it, this is at the base of everything we call physical evil or suffering. Something coming apart that we don't want to come apart. Whether we get a flat tire on our car on the way into work, or a broken leg, or getting hit by a bullet, or having our DNA damaged, or failing to replicate accurately in the genetic field, mutations as we call them, which most of the time are harmful. All of these and may produce cancer, for example. So all these kinds of things are intrinsic to the fact that we are material creatures. We are made of matter. If you're made of matter, sooner or later, that's going to come apart, and you're not going to like it. Okay. Well, though, those mutations, once in a while, turn out to be advantageous. Sometimes there are favorable mutations by chance. And that happens to be precisely the raw material of evolution on which natural selection can work to produce adaptation and bring us from one-cell creatures on up the row of little critters crawling out of the water and eventually starting to look like us. There's no evolution without mutation or without natural selection. But then that natural selection, we already said, enforces that selfish behavior, which in moral agents, intelligent creatures like ourselves, when we start to choose it, not just do it by instinct, but choose to do it, is what we call sin, moral evil. In other words, moral evil has literally evolved out of physical evil. They are not just analogously evil, but there is a genealogical, evolutionary connection between physical and moral evil. But since that is based in the intrinsic breakability of matter, an inescapable problem of anything that's made out of matter as we can conceptualize it, and that has the effect all the way up the line, leading to sin in ourselves, there's no other way for God to have created a material world that would have excluded these possibilities. It would not be possible for God to create a material world in which bad stuff did not happen. And it's only in our own generation that we've been able to connect the dots here and say that there was no other that it's a contradiction in terms. Like, can God make a rock so big you couldn't lift it? No, that's a contradiction in terms. Well, only now can we realize that to say that could God have made a material world in which bad stuff didn't happen, that is just as much of a logical contradiction. So, what happened to the problem of theodicy? It disappears. It does not arise in a thoroughgoing evolutionary viewpoint, or worldview, because you don't have to make excuses for God having bad stuff go on in God's world. It couldn't have been otherwise. You don't need to explain that as a problem. Evil is still very real, but the problem of evil is a pseudo-problem. Philosophically, it vanishes, it does not arise in this viewpoint. Okay, well, over several years, I developed these ideas. I wrote a book about it, as Dr. Trulear mentioned. I started giving talks to parish groups around the area here. Got involved with science and religion activities like the discussion group we have in the Theological Consortium, including Science for Seminaries, and even now lecturing in one of Dr. Ware's classes here last semester, and doing it again just next week. So I'm up to my ears in these kinds of science-religion discussions, which I think is very enjoyable for me and hopefully helpful to somebody else. But the upshot, really, for me at least, Christianity makes a heck of a lot more sense with evolution, seen from an evolutionary viewpoint, than without it. And this is demonstrated by the entire field that we can call evolutionary theology, a whole branch of theology that has developed since the 1950s, initially from the work of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a paleontologist like myself and a Jesuit theologian, and many people since then working in this area, making use of evolutionary science as a positive resource for theology. Not just something that believers can learn to live with, but see as something positive that can contribute to the development of doctrine. And to me, this is a very exciting area of development of doctrine. Now finally, this brings us back to something Dr. Barbara Holmes said in her sermon last night on the other campus, that we need new stories. The old stories, like the creation stories of Genesis, just no longer work for us in this age of science, at least when they're taken literally. But science itself can provide us with a new creation story based on evolution, story of evolution that works both as inspiring myth in the good sense, and as literal history that we can take literally. We are actually seeing what happened in the past. Like Dr. Ahn just said, we've got real data now, not only on the Philistines and the Hebrews' migrations, but the climate changes that were going on at the time. This is not mythology, or legend. This is actual history. But this, making use of it this way, requires us to take the facts of science seriously and use them as a source for doctrinal development, not just as a mine for metaphors, not just speaking metaphorically in terms of evolution in a vague sense of progress or something like that. You've got to get down to the nuts and bolts of how the process works. If you don't do that, you can have problems like Teilhard did. We can go into that another time. But it's tragic that so many Christians see evolution as a stumbling block, when it's really the solution to some of these old problems. And it's the door to a far greater vision of the creation and the Creator. It points to a bigger God than we formerly imagined, as well as a bigger universe. So I offer this as a concrete example of how science can contribute substantively to theology. And we can say of it, we can say of the science, what Jesus says of himself in Matthew 11. Happy is the one who does not find a stumbling block in me. Thank you. You have time to...
We're going to do all three, and then we'll do all
Okay.
questions.
All right.
I first want to thank Dr. Ware and the organizers of the conference for allowing me to participate in this panel. I stand in a somewhat unique position, being a PhD candidate and a graduate assistant on the AAAS grant. But I have benefited myself, and I think our students have benefited from the sort of course evaluation aspect that I have been a part of. So I want to speak a little more pragmatically, since I represent Catholic University here, about how our university has implemented the grant, both generally in terms of what the School of Theology is doing as a whole, as well as in particular in my work with Father Stefanos Alexopoulos on the core course for seminarians on liturgy and sacramental theology. And then I just want to briefly remark on a campus event that we had, which was a symposium on Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home, which for the Catholic community has become one of the benchmarks for speaking of the religion and science dialogue, and you simply can't escape it. It's become incredibly pervasive. So to begin, the Catholic University of America is in somewhat of a unique situation even within the Catholic community, because the students in our seminary program represent both diocesan seminaries, so men training for formation in the priesthood for diocesan work, as well as lay and to be ordained priestly as priest religious brothers. So we have Franciscans, folks of St. Francis de Sales, the Neo-Catechumenal Way. So we have a very wide and diverse population of seminarians that is unique to the Catholic University of America. And so our pastoral concerns range the gambit of local communities to missions to work in academia and elsewhere. Our AAAS grant was headed in our school by Kevin Irwin, David Bosworth, and Bob Miller, representing the areas of liturgy and biblical studies. Since then, they have also incorporated Father Stefanos, who is also in liturgy, as well as Father Ford and Father Lowe, who work in the area of systematic and historical theology, as well as our current interim dean, Dr. Bill Madison, who teaches in the area of moral theology and ethics. So we have 5 different areas of our school represented: ethics, liturgy, biblical studies, systematic and historical theology. All of those professors have incorporated science into their religious classes in various ways. Our systematic professors tend to focus on methodology. So how does scientific methodology impact or dialogue with theological methodology? Dr. Madison, who's working on a course with marriage and moral theology within the aspect of marriage, is looking at issues of gender from a scientific perspective. Biblical studies, as we've already heard, is looking to how science and cosmology and paleontology and anthropology impact our understanding of, especially for our group, the Pentateuch and the Psalms. And then in the area of liturgy, which the AAAS was delightfully surprised to have involved, we look in particular at how neurobiology, psychology, and studies of the mind impact the formation of the person in liturgical acts, as well as how methodology in science and the history of science impacts the doing of liturgical and sacramental theology. So that's kind of the broad overview of the coursework that's being done at the Catholic University. And I can speak most directly to my work with Father Stephanos Alexopoulos on liturgy and sacraments. Now, how I got involved with this project, was addressed in one of the questions earlier, concerns for competency. So Father Stephanos and others, while excited to take on the project, knew that they were not scientists and knew that they needed some help. So in addition to working with our advisors in the scientific areas that Catholic also has, I was asked, since I have a limited scientific background, to assist Father Stephanos in just getting through some of the scientific jargon and evaluating how he envisioned the relationship of science and religion in his course. And so that's why I was brought in, and I worked at a second stage in the process. Father Stephanos developed the first part of the course on his own, and then he asked me to come in and evaluate his course and to help him restructure it. So that's where I come into play. Just to give you an idea of the course we are working on, again, it's a core course for seminarians on liturgy and sacraments. 9 weeks of the course cover liturgical tradition. So how has the celebration of God taken place in the 2,000-year tradition of the church? And what is the development in theology behind that? 9 weeks of the course are devoted to that. 3 weeks of the course are devoted to what we might call liturgical or sacramental themes. Things like, what is the theology of the proclamation of the word? What can we say? What does it say about God and about us when we proclaim the scripture in a liturgical setting? The use of symbol and ritual actions, how that informs who we are, and how that gives us knowledge of God. Euchology or prayer text, liturgical art, and environment are other topics involved. The final 4 weeks of the course are more practical pastoral applications. And these include things like celebration of liturgy of the hours, celebration of marriage, liturgical year, and liturgical spirituality. So this is the time for pastoral application of the themes learned in the course. So what my job was to look at how Father Stephanos had incorporated various scientific sources into these various elements of the course and see why he did it and whether they are successful. So are they just incorporated because it's great to have science and religion in dialogue, or do they actually contribute something to the course? So this is going to be somewhat pragmatic, but hopefully will be helpful if anybody is designing a course or in the future is designing a course. The steps I took were motivated by looking at course goals. So I wanted to see how did the scientific sources meet the aims of the already established course. And to do this, I started by looking at the AAAS resources and saying, what does AAAS want science to do in these courses? And I just want to highlight 2 course goals from AAAS that I invented, that I came up with just to move forward. The first is that we're not creating, AAAS is not wanting us to create science and religion classes, but rather an enriched theology from scientific courses. So that's the first goal. It's not a science and religion class. It's looking to enrich our theology with science, as our 2 panel presenters have already demonstrated very clearly for us today. The second I want to look at is to equip religious leaders with solid scientific foundations from which they can answer questions. And this is a very pastorally focused goal, because it's not the idea that we need our seminarians to know the ins and outs, the exact timing of the Big Bang, the precise genealogical modifications of evolution, which is helpful, but we need to give them the resources when people in their parishes come up to them and say, what is this evolution thing all about? Does it actually contradict my faith? They need to be able to address those pastoral questions. So those are the 2 course goals I developed simply from the AAAS resources. So that's what AAAS wants us to do. So I looked at how can I incorporate that into existing course goals for the liturgy class. And I'll just give you 2 course goals from the liturgy class. The first is to identify and examine liturgical historical sources and their interpretations, a very theological, kind of historical approach, to which you can add contextualized by the scientific and cultural understandings of the day. And we'll get back to that in a moment. The other course goal is to deepen the understanding of sacramentality as a foundation for sacramental and liturgical theology. Again, contextualized by what we understand sacramentality to mean, given our understanding of science. So sacramentality, looking at the fact that we are in fact human, we are in fact material things, and that's important. And what does science say to us about the fact that we are material, and how does that inform with how we relate to God? So that was the starting point, is to take the course goals and say how can they be enriched by the AAAS grant, by science itself. So that was step number 1, and step number 2 was to identify the relationship between science and religion that would help meet these goals. And again, I'm working, in my particular work, on an evaluation of what Father Stephanos had already did. So I looked through and said, why did he include these sources in his syllabus? Why did he look at Edward Grant's review of a history of science when he's looking at Thomas Aquinas on sacramental theology? So that's the next thing. So I observed kind of 4 basic kind of principal relationships in this course between religion and science. The first is scientific phenomena. So how do scientific phenomena impact how we praise God and how we think about how we praise God, or theology of praising God? So for the classic example that all liturgists love to go to is Easter celebration is very different in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, Easter is highly reliant upon springtime images, upon increases in light, upon new life, which to the Australians is going to seem crazy, right? Because that's the start of their winter. So we haven't really, in the tradition at least, we haven't really thought of this, because until the 1900s, 70% of Christians, especially Catholics, and I'm speaking from my own Catholic tradition, 70% were in North America or Europe, primarily Europe. In a study done in 2010, that's completely switched. 70% of Catholics are now in Africa or South America, but also Asia, and only 30% are European and North America. So these are major issues that we need to be thinking about. The second kind of principle of the relationship is method. So how does method in science impact method in theology? So I mentioned before, Father Stephanos included a reading from Edward Grant about how scientific methodology functioned in the medieval universities, is essentially how he used that source. And he pairs it with Thomas Aquinas. And you're thinking, what does Thomas Aquinas have anything to do with science? Well, the scientific methodology of the medieval university is what's called the quaestio method, where you take essentially some major question of the day and you respond to it. You present your alternative, your counter arguments, then you present a general reply, and then you present specific replies to your counterparts. And this isn't a theological method. This is what's being used to study philosophy and what is, at that point, the natural sciences. So this isn't particular to Thomas Aquinas. And it doesn't only impact theological methodology, it impacts theological content. So Thomas Aquinas, in liturgy and sacraments, is well known for focusing on transubstantiation, how the Eucharist is understood to transform or transubstantiate into the body of Christ. And he talks very little about what the Eucharist means for the church. And some people criticize Aquinas for this. However, the idea that the Eucharist related to the local community was not a question. Everybody knew it, right? They took it for granted. What the question was is, how do we relate, or how do we talk about this bread being the body of Christ? So he doesn't address the church as much. He does address it, but he doesn't address it as much partly because of the scientific methodology at the time, which he is applying to his theological endeavors. The third principle of relationship is the history of relationship between science and religion. So we, of course, all know the paradigmatic Galileo and the Pope story. And admittedly, this did not come up as much in the course, but there is a need. It became clear in the doing of the course and in the surveys that were done as part of the course that there needs to be addressed the issue of the relationship between science and religion and how they view one another. So, for example, there's Neil deGrasse Tyson did a reboot on Carl Sagan's Cosmos series, where it's an excellent multimedia production in which he presents scientific ideas very clearly. But at times he looks at theology a little bit differently than might be helpful. So he gives an example of Giordano Bruno, who was a scientist and a monk. And Giordano Bruno was eventually put to trial by the Catholic Church and killed as a heretic. Now, whether you want to go into the details of the Inquisition and the morality of all that is another story. However, how it's presented is Giordano Bruno is killed as a martyr for science, when in fact Giordano Bruno is killed as a heretic for his Trinitarian theology. Now, did his science play a part in that? Yes, it did. The point is, we need an accurate representation from both sides, a fair assessment of science from theologians and from those in the religious community, and we need a fair assessment from religion on the side of scientists. And so what that led us to do is to simply ask our seminaries to open their minds to the idea of science in religion classes, and to re-explore more fairly the history of science and religion, which, in fairness, has not had a clean record. Right? The final bit, which comes in only incrementally, is the use of science as analogy or the use of science as metaphor, but we'll skip that element for now. The final aspect of all of this, in observing those principles and looking at the course goals, is to ask the question, are we really integrating these sources, or are they just kind of added on as a nice idea with our theology classes? So, by combining the aims of the AAAS with the TRS goal, we were better able to incorporate science into the syllabus rather than simply tack it on as a reading or as an additional assessment. Now, there's still work to be done in this area. The Thomas Aquinas example was a particularly successful one. What has been a little less successful as far as integration is the use of neurobiology and psychology on how ritual actions, on how symbol, on how bodily movement, on how preaching actually forms the human person. So we're still working at integration of that. But through these course goals, we think that we have a successful way to accomplish that. So just to briefly close, we wanted to offer some general observations for those who might be engaged as professors in this area, or those who might be attempting to address this maybe in a lecture setting or a symposium setting. The first is don't overextend. The temptation to try to incorporate every aspect of science into your theology classes is there, but what we found is simply exposing through a few examples that science and religion can dialogue, and not only dialogue but enrich one another, is more fruitful than trying to accomplish everything at once. The second is recognize the sacrifices. You have to make sacrifices in the content of both the theology material and the science material. You can't go quite as into depth into each unless you have a specific class looking at this particular relationship, right? So you have to recognize the sacrifice. Attend to the added criteria. So don't forget that the goal is always enrichment. It's always enrichment. And to accomplish the enrichment, you have added criteria. It's not simply to get across a theological idea, but it's to do that in a way that is helpful from a scientific viewpoint, but is also will be helpful for the pastoral ministry, because these questions are real in the pastoral setting. Next, looking out and drawing specific connections. In our experience of going through the course, seminarians had some difficulty in drawing connections themselves at first. Until they got the hang of it, they needed help treading the water, and then eventually they got the hang of it and were able to make connections. And finally, have a recurring theme. So don't get lost in the details. Again, unless you're doing a class specific to a topic like evolution and original sin, have a recurring theme that you can continually reference when you're using science and religion and dialogue. So for example, those principles, method, phenomenon, historical relationship, served as our kind of recurring themes, so that we could point to the students and say, look, this source is speaking to this idea, the methodological idea, or the historical idea. So that's all, so thank you.
And now I'm about to commence the moderating. So, Dr. Ahn, you talked about who controls the water controls the politics. Talk to us about Flint, Michigan, and
I love sitting with Dr. Trulear because he asks these brilliant questions that are culturally relevant. I've been thinking about this question for quite some time. Behind every water situation, politics is always involved, and behind politics, the modus operandi is socioeconomics. The treated water from Lake Huron that was the primary source, and then in order for the city, I guess, the mayor or whomever it was, to save several $1 million, we decided to switch to the rivers or the waters, which precipitated just these consequences that has impacted our communities at large. That was sinful, that was immoral, and unethical. From a biblical standpoint of view, the Bible always talks about being a voice for those who are on the margins, for those who have always been part of God's people, and for those certain groups of leaders to have done what they have did, in my opinion, is egregious, and also actions need to be taken in such a way that we never ever repeat such errors from being done again. Purely from an environmental point of view, why did the EPA wait so long? There were records and plans in which high levels of lead contamination was already being signaled. Why were those signals and why were those warnings ignored? Once again, whoever controls the water controls the politics. And there were very few voices to stand up. Those of you who are following the hearings a couple of weeks ago here in D.C., you're very familiar with the case at large. I was following that case very carefully as well too. Once again, from a biblical point of view, at least from the Hebrew Bible side of it, we need to protect the children and women, and our government failed to do so. And there's an important part of the Hebrew Bible tradition, Old Testament tradition, and that is to speak out and to protect and to be a voice for those who are voiceless.
Dr. Domning, I want to follow up with your presentation. If we've solved the theodicy question, what do we do with the race question? So much of the Negro spirituals, for example, deals with the theodicy question? I mean, do we need a new music to go with a new narrative? How does theodicy impact the politics of race in our country?
I'm not sure how to turn this on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Racism is, I think, basically a special case of sin in general. And to find in the view that I outlined for you there, a general theory of sin, or evil even, certainly does not include racism. And of course, this problem is posed especially acutely with the greatest, most horrific examples of racism that we know of, the transatlantic slave trade, the Nazi Holocaust, and so forth. And people look at something like that and ask, where was God when that was going on? Why didn't God do something to avert those terrific evils? Or how could it possibly come about in the first place if humans are solely to blame, as I would say they are? If you were to write some kind of a mathematical equation to express what I was just arguing for up there, and I'm not sure what that equation would look like, but I'm sure that there would be no term in the equation that set an upper limit to how bad things could possibly be. The sky's the limit. Once you have people who are inclined by their evolution as well as their cultural upbringing to behave selfishly, to put their own interests above those of other people, there's no factor there that is necessarily going to restrain the extent to which they do that. And if you give those people political power, the way Adolf Hitler attained political power, and you have a dictator like that, or even if people who are in our own current political race going on, are showing tendencies towards racial discrimination, what is going to restrain them? And I think the whole scope of history, the whole sweep of history, shows that God is not in the habit of pulling our chestnuts out of the fire, because God takes our responsibility and our autonomy very, very seriously. You could trace this back certainly to the covenant with Abraham. God is very serious about humans holding up their end of the bargain, or the covenant will be suspended until they get their behavior back in line. And this is the whole Hebrew story. I'm sure Dr. Ahmed will back me up on that. So our moral responsibility for our actions is absolute, really. When we will be judged by it, and in the afterlife, we believe our condition will depend on the choices we made in this life. And that's very much the Abrahamic view of human reality. So racism, I don't think, is any exception to that. You can certainly find examples in other species of animals of competition between groups within the same species for resources. And once you have human intelligence added on top of that evolutionary substrate, we can easily concoct all sorts of ideologies to justify our exploiting other people and their resources. We can argue that this other group, however we define them, and race is pretty much a human construct, as I think people generally agree now, we can use that construct to argue that, well, that other group there is in some way inferior to our group, and therefore we're justified in subjugating them, exploiting them, taking their resources, enslaving them if necessary, or simply discriminating against them because, as you said, it costs them less to provide these services to neighborhoods in areas that are inhabited by some inferior race, something like that. That you can always come up with economic and other social justifications. So the Odyssey, I don't think we need to make excuses for why God doesn't do it. God made clear that we have responsibilities, and He's going to hold us responsible for what we do. Did that address your? Okay.
Mr. Stark, I wanted to kind of push you. You talked about some of the implications of ecology for Easter. I'm wondering if you would talk some about how your own work in ecology would impact Good Friday, suffering, crucifixion, sort of the flip side of the coin.
So the Good Friday liturgy, as a liturgist, I always start from the liturgy itself. The Good Friday liturgy, we proclaim, "Behold the wood of the cross, on which hung the salvation of the world. Come, let us worship." So my mind first turns to the fact that our salvation came and was hung on the very material of the earth itself. That salvation is not separated from the world, from the cosmos, but is brought to us in the very cosmos in which we live. The wood of the cross. Now, in many Catholic traditions, people will approach and kiss the feet, and it's a crucifix. But what the instructions actually say is, it's a cross. It's a wooden cross, and you kiss the wood of the cross on which hung the salvation of the world. The other element here is that when you kiss that material on which hung the salvation, on which hung our salvation, you do that as a community. The ritual prescribes, if possible, that there be one cross, that we all approach together, that this is not something that we do as individuals, but this is something that we do as a community. So this community aspect of suffering and of death and of injustice needs to be brought out more in our liturgies, in our sermons, in our theology. What in particularly this brings me to is Pope Francis's development in his encyclical Laudato Si. So again, this is the all-pervasive element of Catholic theology at the moment. So Pope Francis talks there about what's called integral ecology. And this is his major contribution in the encyclical. He's not doing something entirely new. John Paul II before him talked about human ecology, so the fact that care for our environment is also care for those who suffer around us. Benedict XVI talked about how we do that in a communal dimension. He talked about social ecology. But what Francis is doing is precisely what you asked me. It's integral ecology, that our suffering and the suffering of Brother Earth, of Sister Moon, that all of this is united, and that this is what we experience in the Good Friday liturgy, when we kiss the wood of the cross as a community. That all three of these elements, the individual as part of a community, and the individual as part of the world, are bound to one another in our suffering. And that's, I think, the key of theological reflection today. Now, you also have to place this in the context of the whole Paschal Triduum. So this is in the context of the Easter celebration. Behold the wood of the cross on which hung the salvation of the world. It's a celebration ultimately of Easter. Good Friday happened, and we celebrate it again each year. but now we celebrate it with Easter hope. And I think one of the unique parts of the spiritual songs, is that they're always so hopeful in the midst of suffering. And this is something that always strikes Catholics who have never experienced the African American spiritual songs, is that amidst the great suffering, there is hope in there. And it's always hope of a community, and it's always hope from suffering, and it's always hope in Christ. And so I hope that kind of answers the question of how we're all bound in this together.
That's great. Dr. Ware, how are we doing on time?
I was expecting lunch to be in preparation. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So we're doing very good.
Okay, so, but we have time for any questions from the floor?
Yeah, we'll take a few questions.
So I want to affirm the last comment. So it's not necessarily a question, but it's just something to kind of give some more reflective consideration. Because Dr. Bebson's questioning about an interdisciplinary approach and Charles' question about interreligious approach beyond Christian presuppositions, I think is important in this narrative phase. I think what becomes germane here is it doesn't mean that we walk away from what Christian tradition can show us, but what becomes essential or important are other religions that point us to material matter as a way of looking through a religious lens, even vis-a-vis Negro spirituals or any other particular aspect of religion and science. I think the indigenous religions of Africa, of Asia, are important in these conversations to help illuminate what we may be missing through our own Christian lens. So I just want to commend your final comment.
In the rear.
Hey, Kim, Trulear. I have two questions. One is directed towards Professor On. I think your topic is fabulous. My question is more practical in terms of what James Stark had commented. The idea that, it's really exciting when we find these scientific evidences that buttress a finding in the Hebrew Bible or in the text. But how do you deal with situations when you find the scientific data and you can't find a time point in the biblical text? And the premise of that question is actually because pastors are often asked these questions of conflict. It's great when they're important, but what happens when they're in conflict? And then the second question, hold that thought. The second question / comment is to Professor Domning and Professor Trulear. I know that it's really interesting when animal behavior is very mischievous, but there's been a lot of recent evolutionary data and studies in psychology and cognition and neuroscience about role of empathy and role of altruism that is also really conserved evolutionary. And there's a recent study that came out last year in mice where they try to save each other from drowning. It's quite remarkable. But anyway, I just wanted to get your thoughts on the social context. Is there a way that kind of study can be used in social justice and caring for one another? So those are my two. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful question. Contradictions are not something that is odd to the Bible. If you look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, we have contradiction right there as well, too. And it's our Western epistemology that has caused us to go into this sort of understanding what is right and what is wrong. If it's positive, it has to be negative. It's our Aristotelian sort of thinking and our Enlightenment that has forced us into this sort of unilateral way of looking at the text. The ancient Hebrews, or the sort of Judeo-Babylonians or Judeans, so during the Persian time, was a much more fluid way of looking at the ancient world, or even their immediate world at the time. And so, answering your question in a very simple manner, we go to the classical illustration of the time of the conquest during the period of Joshua. Archaeological records have, now there may be some of you who have studied Old Testament or Hebrew Bible that know that archaeological evidence clearly dictate and show that there was no wall of Jericho. In fact, by the time of Joshua, the walls were only knee-high. Archaeological records clearly dictate that there was a wall that sort of people in Jericho built, and we know what ancient walls were actually, how they were composed. Brilliant sort of work of, let's say, mud brick on one side, and there's wood, and then there's leather, and then there's sand, and the exact same opposite occurs. So we find the evidence. But in the biblical records, there's no true memory of a wall during the time of Joshua. So what do you do with this? So pastors have been confronted with this for many, many years, and so scholars have been asking this question since the days of W.F. Albright, which goes back into many, many years ago. And so there's always been this sort of archaeological or scientific evidence that necessarily do not point to what we find in the Bible. So this is where, for someone who's been in the ministry world, this is where faith comes in. You need faith to understand the text. Faith and science is sometimes maybe contradictory, but in my opinion, it's always complementary, not contradictory. There are truths to be in the opposite. And if those of us who are more in our thinking, not just in our sort of Occidental, but in our Oriental way of thinking per se, the opposites create transcendence. The yin and the yang are produced together, and they create something new. They don't necessarily contradict each other, but rather they complement each other and help us to see the greater truth.
Concerning altruism, I didn't want to leave the impression that the only kind of behavior that has evolved has been bad behavior. Good behavior has the same kind of evolutionary history. There's a huge amount of research that's been done on altruism, for example, the evolution of altruism, what's known as reciprocal altruism. I'll scratch my back because you scratched mine yesterday, and maybe you'll do it again tomorrow. In other words, the golden rule, which we've tended sometimes to hold up as the gold standard of morality. It's the absolute lowest rung, the minimal form of morality, and all sorts of other animals practice the golden rule as well. It's purely it's reciprocal altruism, really, that, do unto others as you want them to do unto you. Not a high standard to meet. And so we have the evolution of morality as well as of immorality. Social creatures care about the rules that their societies work by, and they enforce those rules, as you know of experiments recently about that. Animals enforcing rules of fairness on other individuals that they think are being unfair. And so we have had the evolution of morality, ideas of fairness in so-called lower animals, which we have simply elaborated and carried to the construction of law codes and religious codes of morality, and all these social forces that we recruit to shore up the enforcement of the rules that we want our societies to run by. And so that has a long evolutionary history too. It's not only the sinful behavior that has evolved.
Have time for one more question? Yes.
Matthew Robert III, Howard Divinity School. My question is for Dr. Domning. When we consider evolution as a replacement for original sin, how are we to think about the theological narrative of the atonement?
The theological what?
Narrative of the atonement. How are we to think about substitutionary penal atonement?
Oh, the atonement. I think of it as Jesus having shown us a way out of this Darwinian rat race that we have evolved in. The Darwinian theory doesn't point to any larger goal or purpose in life other than getting through your know, your next meal or your next breeding season. It's about survival. Survival is the ultimate good in organic evolution. And when you get to the point of being able to think about that, that's the futility, I think, that Paul talks about. You know, all of creation groaning because of the futility of this kind of existence, looking for a way out. How do you get beyond reciprocal altruism? In Christian theology, we have God coming down and showing us a concrete example of somebody who is perfectly altruistic, somebody who is divine and therefore not in need of any reciprocity from us, doesn't need us for anything, and yet is suffering and dying for us. That's perfect altruism. That's sort of the asymptote that we can only try to approach and never quite perfectly attain, but we get credit for trying. And so what has been, how does Jesus then save us? What does salvation mean, or atonement? Showing it, and rather than redemption or atonement, I prefer the word salvation. How do we get saved? Well, what are we being saved from? I think we're being saved from this rat race that we're in, and here's a concrete human being showing us another way to live that embodies perfect altruism. So the important point in Jesus' role in salvation history, I think is something we've tended to overlook. You know, all of our creeds, our Christian creeds, talk, go through Jesus's biography: born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified. Wait a minute. We went directly from being born to being crucified. Even the Romans weren't into crucifying babies. Come on, it had to be something in between. But it's not mentioned in the creeds. It's Jesus' life that I think was salvific. His teaching, his example, his relationships. His death, the cross, we say that we revere the wood of the cross as embodying our salvation. The cross is the exclamation point at the end of Jesus' life, but it's his life that I think is salvific.
Can we clap?
Well, thank all of our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for our panel. Thank you, Dr. Trulear. If you'd like to leave a donation to the panelists, you may.
He's preaching. He's preaching.
But I hope that you gained so far the excitement that comes from doing this type of work, and the rich possibilities that come from having these conversations. As we come out of this session and go into lunch, it's time for us to have more conversation about what we've heard and anticipation of what will follow this afternoon. Just a reminder about our evaluation forms, that you will give us some feedback on what you're hearing, what your experience is like, and this information will be very helpful to us so that we can do better next time. And we look forward to that next opportunity when we can go another round. So this is something that is a very important initiative for us, and we're glad that we're taking the baby step, and we hope that we can take a bigger step next time. But in order for us to do that, we need you to complete the evaluation form, give us some feedback. That will help us tremendously. So make sure that you have one of these and give it to us, return it to us, so we can have the information to do better on the next go around.